Frammi. Ég ætla að fá að kynna næsta fyrirlesara. Sá heitir Mcfarlane. Hann arkitekt og annar eigenda stofunar Jacob+Macfarlane í París. En hann vinsæll gestakennari og fyrirlesari víða heim. Hann mun meðal annars fjalla verkefni sitt Docks of Paris sem verkefni á vegum Parísarborgar og tekur á endurnýjun mannvirkis við árbakka borgarinnar. Please give a round of applause for Mcfarlane.
Thank you. And thanks very much for T.ark for inviting myself here today to talk about some of our projects in the office, as well as Haldor for being the connection there. It's something I really appreciated very, very much. I'm very touched. And touched also to be back in Iceland because we came here in August after hearing for years and years and years it was the hippest, coolest place on earth to come for a holiday, and being very frustrated because I never came. And then finally making it in August and thinking it was maybe one of the most beautiful places on earth, and then knowing at the end of the vacation maybe we were going to come back and do a conference. So I'm here today. So it's sort of wonderful to be back. A lot colder. So of course surviving the temperatures from Paris. So what I would like to do today, I mean, I was very touched by the projects this afternoon that I saw through from Helder to Christoph. And I think it's interesting. I feel as though some of the things I'm going to maybe even repeat, which is in fact, maybe that's a reason why, Helder is also somehow this Christoph, the part of Helder, the part of Christoph, and then I think, in fact, I build on that a little bit, which is interesting. It's kind of the first time I've done a conference that way. And so there's issues that I think Christoph was talking about in his projects, which I believe, the projects of the office, that I believe we're very much interested in. I think it's the kind of world we live in today and the kind of values that we want to communicate with as architects. And it's all about finding what is the way of talking in the world today as an architect. I mean, I think very much, the big moves that we saw, the kind of so-called heroic architect, which Christoph talks about. I don't have the photos of the guys in their buildings, but certainly, every sort of major building that we've worked on as existing buildings has those kinds of histories of individuals, of people that really believed very strongly and had a very strong, clear project. I have about 4 of those kinds of projects. But what's curious in a way for me is I'm not actually presenting any modernist architectural buildings as existing buildings which have been transformed. I'm presenting a series of really more industrial buildings which have been part of that movement, but from an engineering industrial sense. The same period, the same epoch, even dealing with the most contemporary one, which I'll show you first. But of course, the issues of transformation of an existing building and as a site and how you go about that conceptually are the same kinds of issues, the same kinds of interest, whether, of course, it's a conscious modernist piece of architecture or, let's say, a much more functional piece of infrastructure as a building. It's really, at the end of the day, essentially for us, the same kinds of issues that are involved in that transformation. So the first project I will show is a project that we did for a Renault car company in Paris a number of years ago, about 10 years ago. And it was this building. And this building was designed by a very famous architect who died not too long ago, called Claude Vasconi. And maybe it's one of, although Claude probably wouldn't have agreed, but still I think it's one of his more passionate pieces. And it's passionate because of its situation along the river. I don't really have a pointer, but along the river to the north of the photo, we have the Seine, the Seine River. And the building is a series of shed roofs, a triangle at the bottom. And though the whole building complex was designed to be part of the new Renault car factory headquarters in Paris. What they were planning on doing was demolishing all of the old buildings and building about 20 of these things. So this actually served as curiously enough, as a prototype, as the first one of many that would be demolished and eventually built in the 1980s. Of course, what happened was within the Renault company, a lot of things happened in the early 80s. There was a massive social strike. There was issues of how would one expand within a city. There was more and more conflicts about building industry within the city, well, on the edges of Paris. So all of this led to a building that was never used, and it became just a massive storeroom. And Renault, as a car factory, moved out into Versailles and other places around France, and on the outside. So it moved out and evacuated this building. And in the 2000 period, Renault came to us and said, look, we have a big problem. We've now we've left the cultural center of Paris, and we're no longer associated with, through our designers, we're no longer associated with the life of the city and in a way, the energy of a big city. We're out disassociated from it. What we'd like to do is take this building and reinvent it and put a new program inside, which was about communication and about creating or a visionary program which would be seeing about 3 years or 4 years down into the future, and asking themselves through their design team what the future car would be about. So it was really like a brainstorming program that we were asked to introduce into this project. It was a competition. We won the competition. And so it was an existing building, and within the building we were asked to create a whole series of new architectures based around the program. So these are just images of that building. Well, when we arrived, it was just a little bit before these photos. They didn't have the wooden boxing around them, but the space we thought was absolutely extraordinary. What was very interesting is that the brand of Renault as a company is based on a losange. It's like a hexagon, which is deformed slightly sideways. And what Vasconi, we found, had done in the roof of this building, had introduced geometrically the losange. As you look down the length of the building, you complete through 3 different transformations of that by the roof, and you complete the full form of the losange. So that became a kind of a geometric reason behind the geometry of the roof, and therefore the roof, of course, became extremely interesting to us. Where, as an office, of course, we're interested very much in this issue of, like Christophe, reading the buildings beforehand, looking at their histories, looking at them as situations which could develop a new architecture from that. And in this case, we became very fascinated by the roof, of course, for the history behind the losange, and then asked ourselves, in fact, if we could actually imagine a structure which was generated, a whole new architecture, as an intervention inside an old existing building that could be generated from this roof, this unique roof geometry. So through that, of course, we did a lot of sketching. As you can see here in this question of taking everything broke down into a 30-60 angle, and then dealing with this idea of a program and plan, but also a compaction in terms of the 3 different heights of the roofs, which went from 3 to 6 to 9. Finally, we worked with introducing these programs. Now, the programs, of course, were all sorts of things like amphitheaters, meeting halls, huge exhibition space for future prototype cars, many different elements, anyway, programmatic elements inside the thing. But essentially what we did was we kept the middle of this section open, fully open and treated in a way the rest of the program down both sides. If you looked at the orange elements, they're the programmatic, the more fixed pieces, and the interior part being a huge exhibition space. And then all of that being compacted down, so the white walls really are generated walls extruded from the existing roof condition, and as they come down, they bring light, natural light down, filtering onto the first, the second, the first, and the below ground level, in such a way that they are natural light for all of the office spaces and interior spaces. And these white walls, of course, also become exhibition walls towards the central space. So they have multiple functions. This is just an idea of the different programs inside, from meeting rooms to work rooms. And again, quick views around that. And so at night, you have some kind of idea of what that space is like, seen from the higher wall and inside the space. So of course, again, it's this issue of how you reveal the beauty of the existing structure, but how also by your intervention you give a new life. And I think all of the projects I'm about to show are all about that, which is trying to, in a way, create a new dynamic within an existing condition. So, of course, these are views, and I'm going to go through them fairly, not spend too much time being involved. Of course, the whole issue of the automobile, their metallic walls, and the fastening of those in parallel with kind of the habillage, the skin of the car. I mean, there's some nice parallels. So these are the spaces that we created, and the kind of interior spaces, some of the spaces inside the workspaces, some of the brainstorming rooms. It's a huge number of people were working in this site up until recently. And strangely enough, now I was just talking to Christophe after malheureusement en French. Unfortunately, we had the site was sold by Renault. We didn't know about this to a private British investor who wanted to demolish the whole building and create a 30-story building. So we were involved then in a very strange situation where we became ourselves we generated, along with a whole lot of other architects, a petition that was sent to the Ministry of Culture saying the building was actually an important piece in the work of this architect and it should not be demolished. So that was a very strange situation. You became then a kind of defender of your own work. And the last thing we've heard is that maybe we will come back in and be involved with another architect and imagining some kind of intervention, but on top of the existing building. So we'll see what happens. These are interesting spaces in that the amphitheaters are designed as spaces where you can drive a car in and turn the car around, etc. So this is it at night. To get an idea of the site, if you know Paris, this island in the background is called Île Séguin, and it was, of course, the island where Ando was going to build his huge museum for a very important art collection. That was cancelled, and it's an ongoing debate as to what actually will be built on the island. There's a project by Shigeru Ban. There is a huge urban project by Jean Nouvel, but it's still very ambiguous as to what is going to happen at the site. The second project is called the Cube Orange in Lyon. Now, Lyon is a very interesting city. I tend to think it's one of the more interesting cities architecturally today. Paris has tended to be difficult to work with. We haven't really accomplished so many new pieces of architecture, we as architects, in Paris. But in a city like Lyon, it's become a very interesting platform for contemporary architecture. Here with the city of Lyon, as you can see, there's two major rivers, the Rhône and the Saône, that come together, and they form this area up to the right-hand side. They form a point, which is called the confluence area. And in that area, which is this in plan, all of that area in the Middle Ages was a swamp. or beforehand was a swamp, I should say, and in the Middle Ages really became a kind of an area that no one wanted to go to. People were, the worst kind of people lived there outside of the city. It was considered a very dangerous area. In the 18th, 19th century, it was an area of prisons, brothels, everything the city didn't want to know about was in this whole territory. So its territory really in the 19th century became quite important industrially. Train lines, big train depots were put there, industrial buildings were put down to the right. There was big industrial complexes, and also to the left. And so these early photos, and this is why I wanted to include some of these things, give you some idea of the kind of landscape. Then we found ourselves here in the 1930s. You can see in 40s, you can see some of the existing depots. They were very interesting because the barges that came along the Saône would stop alongside. You had a series of major cranes that were between the buildings, and there would also be on rails, light trains that would be on rails between the buildings and the boats. But essentially, goods were bought off the boats and put in these storehouses. And the storehouses were dealing mostly in grain, salt, a series of elements like this, and agricultural products brought up the rivers. Of course, all of that changed and finished in the 60s and 70s. So what you really had then was this extraordinary quantity of building material that was empty. And into the early 80s, some of those building spaces then became interesting to the artistic community. One of the first biennales in Lyon for the arts was created in one or two of these buildings, but it wasn't evident what the city could do with it. And what happened was that there was an interesting amalgamation of artistic interests, economic interests, and all of a sudden the city becoming interested in this whole site, thinking that maybe they could reclaim it as an extension of the downtown city of Lyon, and that's actually what's been happening. This transformation then has taken place for the last 20 years, and we have been part of that. These are earlier photos of some of the uses. This is inside one of the buildings that we called Les Salins, which is the salt storage building. And it's a building that we transformed later into a very big restaurant next to a building which we call today the Cube Orange. This is a photo, I think, from the 1970s or early 80s, giving you an idea of that whole zone. So it's a huge chunk of a city right in the heart of a major French city, which became available very, very recently, and has led to a series of interesting projects. Here in this photo, you can see there's two images. It's very dull, the light, but you can see that there's an orange box just to the left-hand side, and then off to the right, there's a green box down here. And these were two new projects that we designed called the Orange Cube and the Green Cube. The Orange Cube being finished first, which is going back about 7 years now. And this is the project here. And you can see some of the older buildings, the Les Salins, which is the salt storage building on the right, which is the 3 arches. And then, of course, this crane on the left. Our project for the Orange Cube is somewhere between the two. So the problem here was that the client, it was again a competition, and the client asked us to work on 2 sites at the same time, which led to an idea which could then be iterated between 2 sites. And here we were meant to keep the Les Salins building, but demolish a building right next door to it, which was less interesting, and build a cube of space. It is essentially, the program stated that they wanted to be public spaces for the first couple of levels and then office above it. And the office, of course, problem was we had a cubicle volume, which is has become interesting for us in a sense here on this site, because it became a volume of space that was buildable. And it was a way of not actually making a decision about somehow an architectural form, but actually taking the neutrality of what we found as a found buildable space and then deciding that the programmatic meter square that we're asked for is space, we would put into the program and find that because it was an office building, we needed to bring light in. We could only go a certain depth. And that became this idea of a cone, and a cone that would bring zenithal light down through the building, but then actually we wouldn't need to bring it down to the two lower levels because they were big open levels. So we came up with this idea of a cone, which punctuates the building from the top down and then comes out onto the side of the river, and thus making a kind of a very strange space, which is a deformed atrium space. But it's an interesting space. So here, somehow conceptually, I hope they work. They don't. Great. Oh, they do. They're kind of visible, aren't they? Very, very faint. Anyway, there's a series of cones that come together and break into that volume. These are just conceptual diagrams. These are air diagrams showing how the river, in fact, is an airway, a very important airway. And so what came out of this was the idea that the cone is not necessarily just bringing light into the building, but also bringing air through the building. We can use it as a chimney and thus reducing the climatic costs of the building over the year. Of course, the arches, there's an allusion to this idea of taking the geometry of the arched industrial piece and again bringing that through as a way into making these windows. And of course, the windows become big balcony spaces. So if you're looking in plan, what's interesting about it is that then the office floors all share these balcony spaces, which become really like big breakout spaces for the office, which are very interesting. This is the top of the building, which again becomes this public for the building, a kind of outside office space in summer. A section through that piece, through the building. Another kind of section, and the finished building. So here you have a kind of an idea of the site. It's a very interesting urban site because it gives, on the one hand, we have Lyon urban on the right, and on the left we have Lyon bucolic landscape with river. And it's a very fantastic contrast between the two sides, which of course also helped us make this large gesture towards the river and not back in towards the old train track side. Knowing full well that all of this space in front of the building would then become a huge lineal landscape park, which would then become a very, very popular space of promenade. So these are kind of some ideas of the spaces, the balcony spaces, different kind of office levels around the building inside the cube, and the views out onto the landscape in different ways. The oculus bringing light down inside the building. All the geometry, of course, is related to the cuts as you bring this kind of atrium through an orthogonal condition. The kind of unique views that you have out and also across. A double layer, which again is environmentally interesting because it's really like a solar umbrella, a sun umbrella, decreasing radically the amount of solar gain into the building, but leaving very beautiful views out to the river. Through these kinds of holes, and this kind of terrace, and these views up and down the river. So, nighttime, interior of lower levels, public levels, wall. Okay, so third project. Again, it's an interesting project in the sense that you have here Orleans is a city, smallish city, but still very significant city on the edge of the Loire, and an hour from Paris, on a site which is kind of, you can't see it very. I was hoping I would have a pointer, but the point is anyway, it's that very pale point. I don't, but it's that very pale point. If you can see it, kind of a cloud-like thing with then the green line, you can see a kind of a green line of landscape. It's not, I'm being a bit vague, but anyway, as it comes around, you've got this, from the north you have a train line coming in from Paris, the major train station, and then Orléans is very interesting because you have a thing called the Maille, which is like a kind of a loop, but it's only half a loop because here you have the river of the Loire that cuts through that. And the Maille is very interesting because here on that, if we go to another image, and I apologize for the fuzziness, but it's all I could find in terms of what it used to be like as a site. You have these old buildings which were called les subsistances, bâtiments subsistance, and it was where food was manufactured and processed for the French army. Before that, it had been a convent. It had been a prison before that. So the site is a very interesting ancient site. And this road where the landscape, which I was saying was the Maille, was actually the wall around Orléans. And after the revolution, of course, that wall, or during the revolution, but after the revolution, that wall was destroyed. And then the city continued out beyond. So we were right on the edge of agricultural land to the left. And the middle-aged, the city of the Middle Ages was all of this zone up to that green space. Our site that I want to concentrate on is the orange-roofed, orange brick terracotta roof, and the small building here in the middle of that. And it's interesting because Christoph was mentioning this issue of talking about old buildings, what you do, how you approach them. It is nice to keep them most of the time, but sometimes it's quite nice to demolish parts. And that's an interesting issue because up until this point, we'd been very, very keen on keeping old buildings and working with them as transformations and using those as sites. But here we realized our biggest problem on this competition was that we had to transform a building which was extremely closed for military reasons all its life, had been all about protection around an inner courtyard that you could never really get to. And in the competition, they asked us to propose a new, it was for a new center of architecture, like an architectural museum called the FRAC. But the major push of the competition was to bring the public into the site and introduce the public, a greater public, whether they're from Orléans, whether they're from France, or whether they're internationally. It was to bring those into a site which had been very protected and closed. So we realized actually fundamentally, in this case, we had to probably, we maybe could have kept it, but I think we did the right thing in the end, was to demolish a building. Of course, that was an interesting situation because we had to come up with very good reasons because it was considered a historic piece. It was just this building to the right. So these are old photos. And the building, of course, to the right here is the old building before we demolished it. But our argument was that we kept the building to the left and we demolished this middle one. Our argument was that by opening it up, we would open up also the site to the city and make it, give it a civic function which it didn't have before that. So here in this image, you see it's just after the demolition of that building. And the question then became, we had two different histories. We had a history of an 18th century building and a 19th century building. And often in our projects, we're very interested in this idea of tissage, of how to work with a building, but go back into its geometry, go back into its historical fabric. And again, like Renaud, ask ourselves, what's the essence? Can we go back into something which is actually avoiding almost an architectural vocabulary, almost like going back into the skeleton of the body and finding that? And so here what you see is this new piece, which we called Les Turbulences, or the turbulence, like a meteorological condition. And it was a story we made where two histories came together. The 18th and 19th century grids of both these old buildings came together, but they never fitted. They were never meant to fit because they were two different histories. And somehow what they led to, we realized, was that it wasn't about making them come together. It was about revealing the discrepancy and the misfit between the two. And that's why we ended up creating this piece called La Turbulence. But the turbulence became a very interesting jumping off point because it became really a metaphor also for the collection. And the collection is a collection of utopic architecture since 1945, and one of the third great collections in the world today of drawings, models, ideas. And it's a public museum which is visitable, etc. A very, very interesting place. This is a model which we call the skeleton model, which was about bringing those ideas together. The ground floor. So the entry, of course, is inside this piece. And the piece we knew had to be an entry, which we were asked for in the program to make a new entry. This new entry we also knew had to have this role as a phare or a signal as to a new life, but at the same time signalize somehow what the program was about, the new program was about. So here is just taking you through some standard kind of drawings. We worked a lot with, we tend to work a lot with artists in our projects, which makes sense in many ways. We worked with light artists in terms of the facade, who became very interested in this idea of representation of a point, a line, and a surface being the fundamentals of architecture, representation. And of course, in a digital age, it's all about light. So we took the building really as a drawing, or they took the building as a drawing and proposed a light intervention, which I'll show you about. These are just development drawings, which serve me other purposes for other conferences. This kind of conference is not about discussing those kinds of drawings, neither really the complexity of putting together a very digital project from conception right through to making. But this gives you some kind of idea of its presence today as a piece. So we really imagined it as a kind of a deformation of the whole courtyard space and the history of these buildings, these existing buildings. And then somehow one gets in and out of these in a kind of almost a zipped part of that surface, that urban surface, which is unzipped. And you seal yourself in through that to get inside really what is a series of the first spaces inside these things is a big hall, but the hall is really like an outside space. It's really like a tent in a way. And the wall on your right-hand side is the old wall of the building. So when you come in, you're actually still outside, inside the old courtyard space. And this space is a very important place because it's really like the French have a wonderful word called carrefour. It's a crossroads, and it's where all the different circulations of the building come together, but where we have a lot of ongoing projects of pedagogic projects. It also becomes another exhibition space. So it has this kind of informality, nodal quality about it. Oops. Sorry. I'll just go back to where I was. Just jumped out of that. So this project, anyway, I'm just coming towards the end of the frac, and then I have one more project. So this is the... Okay. Just taking you around some images. And so we had this role, of course, not only creating a new piece of architecture, but actually very much about then restoring and taking us back to the older building inside. So all the effort here is about reduction of simplifying as much as we can. The complexity of layers that have been built up over time in order to create also gallery spaces that are somehow neutral enough, but at the same time we know about the history of these spaces. So it was about revealing their formal language. This is the light intervention at night on the facade. What's interesting with the light intervention is that it's, again, it's not a, it's something which is generated from its site. It's a light sculpture which changes over time. It has two major inputs. It has the traffic of Orléans, the traffic around the edges of Orléans, which is which is of course monitored and sent to the server of the building, as well as the meteorological, the weather conditions over Orléans. So the light sculpture piece is really like an ongoing, developing piece of architecture. It's in process, like the turbulent condition, and very much like the contents. And then the last project, it's the green piece that in the introduction you gave, you talked about the docks, which is a project which I know which is kind of one of the reasons I'm here today, because it was a project which was seen to be a transformation of a very present building in the center of Paris, an old building called the Docks of Paris, one of the first reinforced concrete buildings in the world, 1907. It was considered really a piece of infrastructure. So all of the concrete that you're seeing under here is something which was, we're looking at like 170 meters long, but in reality it was over 300 meters long. And over the years it was chopped and cut up, and actually there's much less. I think today we have about 200 meters. But you can imagine the presence of this piece within the city. And we won a competition, and the city of Paris in the competition brief said to us, listen, you can do what you want. You can demolish it or keep it. And which we were really sort of pleasantly surprised, but also shared with a level of shock, because we knew that the thing had obviously gone through this sort of amazing history. We found out later, but after we won the competition, that Le Corbusier had looked at the building, been fascinated by the building, and wrote about it. And he wrote about the building in the 1900s. And Domino House, of course, came in 1922. And when you looked at the Domino House and you looked at this building, it's absolutely the same kind of scenario, but in a micro chunk. So I find the building historically for the history of architecture radically important. But of course it becomes this issue, which is a very interesting issue, where, and that would be a question I would throw out today, is where, at what point, at what age do you consider a city, that the architecture is worth saving up until what date? Or is that actually an absurdity, and in fact it's not about a date, it's about possibly other issues? I would hazard, of course, that it's about other issues. But still, in France, we have a thing called patrimoine, and it's all about historic precedents. And our ideas about history are not, we don't share the same ideas as what I've just put forward. The patrimoine is all about, reinforcing this idea that history has to be a certain age. Anyway, so there's a discussion there which is very interesting, because it really is then related to this idea of at what point can you transform something as opposed to demolish it. So, obvious images, the construction of it. Now, I've got to tell you that the building was hated by Parisians. They saw this under construction and they went, and they thought it was one of the ugliest things on earth. And in fact, in a weird way, they were probably right. Because as you can imagine, you're in the heart of Paris. In the background, I mean, we know that in that image, in the background, you can actually find the Notre Dame, the tower, somewhere in the back. And you can see in this image, it's a fantastic image, because you have in the foreground, it's the edge of the 19th century, it's horse, it's cart, and in the background you have this monster, or seen to be this monstrosity, which is the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. It's reinforced, it's a new technology. It's really what the digital age is today, or was, because let's say it's been around now, the revolution of the digital revolution, but this was actually right on that cusp between the 19th and 20th century. So the photo was remarkable in that sense. You know, in the foreground you have the Middle Ages as something that hasn't changed at all, you know, since that period. And in the background you have something absolutely radical. So the building was built for this, and you can imagine it was a storehouse, had no walls. It was a completely open structure to the elements, the wind, the rain, etc. Well, rain to a certain degree, no, but wind, yes. And the boats, again, like Leon, pulled alongside and pulled by cranes that were invented and designed by Gustav Eiffel, the same guy that did the tower, taking those goods up and bringing them inside this huge storehouse. So it became really the docks of Paris for storing foods, agricultural, again, lots of different goods inside it, and then taken off by horse and cart. As you can see here, the top of the building was designed like railway lines, parallel lines that would take these cranes moving right across. You can get an idea of the scale. There's a man just off to the right inside that machine. Images which seem much older. Again, it's, you know, there's this kind of strange, fascinating kind of dichotomy of representation and reality. The building in the 1970s, by that point, or I should say no, the 1990s, by that point, that's why the city of Paris said you can get rid of it if you want. Well, we said in our competition, it was a public competition, and we said in our competition brief, we said there's no way we should demolish this building. If you gut it, a little bit like what Christoph was doing, if you gut the building and just take it down to its skeleton, it's absolutely fantastic. You would never build a building, I haven't got those images, but you would never, you know, you would never build a building like that today. We have like 3.5, 4 meters between floors. Of course, today it would be shorter for economic reasons. And you would never have the concrete beams 12 centimeters thin. You know, either they would be prefabricated, so it's another system, but not poured in place, probably, and extremely deep. So those kinds of things we saw, and we said, this is absolutely fantastic. Plus, the concrete is like rice bubbles mixed with cement. You could never do it. It would have to be sort of, you know, it couldn't be that kind of concrete. And the beauty of the rice bubbles mixed with cement, the small stones, was that it was all poured by hand. So you can see the pour marks, you can see the way people were making this prototype. They would be pouring a beam for, you know, I don't know, 3 days, 4 days, just one beam. So all of that is extremely important to us, not just as architects, but as people on this planet, seeing how something like this was, being a building like this was, of course, leading us very, very quickly into a future. And so what we did was we said the most interesting thing is that skeleton. Why don't we then actually try and take the skeleton and find within it a way of generating a new phantom condition off the old building? And so we came up with this system of a pointer line, an arborescent structure. And by doing that, we found that we could generate a completely new fluid, organic piece, but that was related to the history of the building, but was completely in its new epoch. It's a digital, it's a light piece, and it's a topographic landscape, which is absolutely generated from the original geometry, which led to this creature called the plug, which we named the plug over. And of course, there's allusions to archigram with the plug in, but in this case, it's much more low-tech. It's almost like a kind of a post-industrial piece. And, but essentially, all of the geometry, of course, is perfectly fitted with its old host. And all of the arguments are very interesting there, of course, because the host, because it was could hold these almost train-like cranes, we knew that we could also hold incredible weights in terms of the new architecture to be proposed. So somehow I'll move you through that. The inside was very simple, that we decided that really we wanted to treat the inside just as a box-like architecture and reveal and leave as much of the skeleton of the old building as visible as possible. So in those, this gives you some idea. The city of Paris said we could go up 1 level if we wanted, which we did. They said you could go over the city, over the edge of the river by so many meters, which we did. And we found we could go over the back, over the boulevard side. So it led to this idea of a new architecture which was generated and clipped over an existing infrastructural piece. And I say infrastructure as opposed to necessarily architectural. But of course, it was like putting a face on a friend, or a face on a faceless thing. And it was really about where we would make that face. And we knew the Seine River was a very interesting new cultural river, like London and its precedents for opening onto that edge. Paris has had that possibility here. So we made the facade, of course, over the river, knowing very well that what we were doing was hosting also the possibility of future events and future ways in which the river could be regenerated as a user river, not just as a tourist river. And that's a fantastic thing, because it's exactly that, which is what's happened. It just takes you, the irony of the period is that we built it in the Eiffel workshops that Eiffel was using in the 1920s. That was just by chance. And we bought the building. The building was put into place using barges, the same system that we were using in the 19th century to feed coal or other products, turnips, into the building. We were using absolutely the same type of barge, but in this case, clipping onto the outside of the building, and a completely new digital project. And then here's the finished project. This gives you some idea of its presence as a piece, and how we tried to find this place that was somehow between an existing condition and a new project. And both, we hope, we know that by now because the thing's been open about 6 or 7 years, but both live off each other and give meaning to each other. And I think that's a very important idea, that one can make additions and transformations, and one can be actually quite heavy-handed about it. It's not necessarily to come in and also just be very, very low-key with it, but you can also be very happy. But I think what is very important in these kinds of issues is find the story, find the way in which you can connect, for us anyway, certainly as an office, find the way in which you can connect to the past or the history of that and be part of that. And that's what we try to do here. Other views. This gives you some idea of the old structure, which is visible, which is a fabulous concrete stuff. And it's interesting, Christoph, because you were talking about this issue of the historic, it wasn't called the Historic Places in Britain, the group that asked you to keep the concrete. English, thank you. English Heritage. Very interesting. Smart group. We never had that in France, where they said, keep the two readings, the readings of the existing condition and the new concrete. I love it, and it makes complete conceptual sense. And it's what we did here. But we did that, and we also knew that some of the beams had to be entirely replaced. And it was just, at some point, we added steel beams. So they really there was this whole discourse that we had about bracing the body, and with two methods, the one of the new concrete and the one of changing the material completely. But it's a really interesting subject. And it's a conceptual subject, because when you transform a thing, you're absolutely up against this thing of like, how much do I leave? How much do I add? How much do I cover? And in leaving, what can I reveal? So your position as an architect in terms of the history of the building is a very interesting one. So you have I think you have a tremendous array of options, and I think those are that would make another whole conference in terms of those kinds of issues. So here you're inside that structure. What we did here was, a little bit like yours, you knocked out the facades. Actually, here we knocked out some big spaces. We almost came in like a Gordon Matta Clark and cut out some of the floors in order to actually open up a transparency of the building from the boulevard down to the water. And this gives you some idea of the concrete again, and some of the events that have gone on inside. You know, I think it's an interesting project because a lot of people feel as though they can appropriate it. We have like a honeycomb of old concrete skeleton structures, and there's a lot of different events that have gone on inside the building because it does have this loft-like quality, which is easily appropriated. This is on the terrace level, so of course it's a new landscape, it's a new terrace, but what's very interesting is that when we visited the site, we saw that that terrace could be absolutely the most extraordinary terrace, this idea of using a rooftop of an existing building and how then that rooftop could be connected and help connect back the people of Paris to a part of the city that they considered quite ugly. And it wasn't just due to this building, but it was due to some of the buildings. I mean, again, I'm not going to, some of the buildings around the edge. It's a little bit mean to talk about these ones because they're recent architectural pieces. So I'd probably give a heart attack to the architects that I talked about on that side. And I'm wondering if I've got images on the other side. But across the river anyway is a lot of projects from the 1960s and early 70s, which are quite tough. And again, Parisians were quite reticent about looking onto that. And we knew that when we did our piece, we had this possibility of opening up like a new regard onto that period. And it's worked. You know, there's that part of the river now has actually become extremely interesting to a lot of people in terms of that period, the 60s and the 70s. These are kind of just some of the events we've had inside, you know, the building was generated. I mean, I'm not even telling you the program, but the title in French is Cité de la Mode et Design, City of Fashion and Design, or just called Cité, the city. But inside, the idea was to bring together fashion and design, those two worlds, and create new synergies and new programs that would come out of it. And it's what exactly has happened. These were just some examples. We had Comme des Garçons, Irak Kawakuba, saying that she would never, before she died, do an exhibition of her work. But when she saw the building in the space, she made an exhibition for only the space, which is this exhibit here, so we were completely thrilled about that. Balenciaga, very interesting exhibition inside the building. The building has become a major hub for fashion défilé in Paris, and fashion shows and art shows and a lot of events, because it becomes it's a very interesting, in a way, it's not such a neutral building. It has a position and it has an experience to propose. And outside of just seeing a défilé, which this could happen in any industrial building in the world. So I'm not claiming anything special on that. But I think what's interesting about the building, it does have all of these other kind of ways in which you can use the building and therefore make these kinds of spaces inside the building even more interesting. At night, again, working with Jan Casali, I think France's most interesting light artist, lighting the building at night, trying to find a kind of conceptual way in which the building could become a major contemporary piece onto the facade of the river and reinforcing the river as a major cultural hub. And what's quite exciting with that is that that has happened more recently in the history of Paris, where the Parisians now are starting to think about the river as a front and as a lineal piece and as in a way the heart of Paris. As opposed to objects, you know, thinking of the river as a kind of a continuous thing which links a whole series of cultural events all the way along. And that's a very exciting thing because it's involved also in this issue of what is outside Paris, that the river keeps on continuing, and, you know, giving up, of course, all sorts of very interesting possibilities to the west and the east of Paris outside. And that's it. Okay. Thank you.